Who do you think is the best dressed analyst?
Oh, well, two psychoanalysts that I know who are both a sort of a renegade Lacanians, Anushka Gross and Patricia Gerovici, are both extremely stylish. And so they're very interesting. And Anushka was the one who told me first about, some book written about how to be a psychoanalyst, where out of the Anglo-Saxon sort of Kleinian Freudian perspective, they all tended to dress in a way that wasn't going to trigger the analysand. They wouldn't be too narcissistic. They wouldn't be too eccentric. So she even told them women not to wear trousers, which in the mid 90s is kind of weird, like really. Wow. So Anushka, of course, said that turned her more towards the Lacanians, who were more willing to have the analyst be dressing in stylish or eccentric ways. I mean, God knows Lacan himself was a weird dresser and seemed probably extremely narcissistic. But in any case, that allowed Lacanians the freedom to wear different things.
One of the things that I found amazing, because in addition to putting together psychoanalysis and fashion, the book that's accompanying this exhibition is also a kind of incredible history of psychoanalysis. But there were all of these details that I learned, like that Freud was so fastidious about his beard that he went to the barber every day. And this blew my mind. I actually, because I read the book first, I pulled Patrick into the other room. And I also texted one of my college roommates who's very interested in psychoanalysis and in clothes, and was like, did you know that Freud was late for his father's own funeral because his barber had a line? I mean, I've read a lot of histories of, the field. And it was like, I can't believe I didn't know this.
Oh, I know. And there were things that didn't even get in the book because I found out later, like Anna Freud, one of her patients said, did you knit during your sessions with patients? And she's like, well, yes, I can hardly use a sewing machine. I mean, she made all her own clothes, but she was not willing to use the sewing machine while supposedly listening to the patient.
I didn't even reading the book, which is just fantastic. And if people are listening, they should go out and buy the book immediately. In addition to the prose being...
Well, it's not out yet, so you can't say that.
Pre-order it. In addition to being just beautifully written, the photos in it are amazing. And I don't want to pun, the sort of connective threads that your reading of the history of psychoanalysis and of the history of fashion uncovers were ones that I somehow just had not seen, and yet are fully in the warp and woof of everything, from from Freud's father being in the wool business to Anna's sort of the line or two from patients and colleagues, like, well, she didn't dress great, right? This idea of sort of this frumpy, sort of self-effacing daughter, and once you start tugging on one of those things, it all kind of comes together, or at other points comes apart.
Comes unraveled.
In generative ways. It's a phenomenal.
Well, Freud's own obsession with sort of respectability politics and shopping like a maniac shopper when he couldn't afford it, and paying his tailors in installments, thinking, how can I pay? I live in dread of my tailor's bill. That was so fascinating. And that, of course, is just really interesting that he had this sort of shopping issue. Yeah. And then after he got married, he just handed it over to his wife and turned to collecting antiques. And that became his next shopping obsession.
I was so struck by that letter to Martha early in their courtship, where he's like, well, once I've arrived and I'm making enough money, not only can I pay my tailor, in something other than installments, I will furnish you, my princess, with the dresses you deserve. And then come marriage, actually, she's doing the buying and he's moved on to antiques.
Right. But I mean, it is very, very interesting that they all had these relationships with clothes. I mean, and his was very orderly. And then Lacan was completely out of control and wearing weird clothes and, shopping obsessively for just the right material for something. And, his colleagues going, why is he so obsessed with dressing up and costume parties and, all these, and then his followers, his acolytes, all imitating his style. Yeah. As, of course, Freudian acolytes have imitated Freud's style, although it's gotten more casual.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so delighted to welcome Dr. Valerie Steele to the show. Dr. Steele is director and chief curator of the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology, where she's organized more than 25 exhibitions since 1997. She's the author or editor of more than 30 books, including Dress, Dreams, and Desire, Fashion and Psychoanalysis, which comes out this fall in tandem with a major exhibition at the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology that culminates years of scholarly research. Dr. Steele is also the founder and editor-in-chief of the first scholarly journal in fashion studies, Fashion Theory, the Journal of Dress, Body, and Culture. Described in the Washington Post as one of fashion's brainiest women and by fashion critic Susie Menkes as the Freud of fashion, Dr. Steele has been instrumental in creating the modern field of fashion studies and in raising awareness of the cultural significance of fashion. Valerie, welcome. We're so delighted to have you on the podcast.
I'm very pleased to be here.
So let's get into it. Before we talk specifically about these kind of two twin terms that we're going to be working with today, fashion and psychoanalysis, and about the upcoming exhibit at the museum at FIT, I wanted to start with an anecdote that you've recounted several times about earlier in your career when at a party someone is like, what do you study? Academics in our audience will be familiar with this sort of like, weird status-y kind of game. And you say fashion. And there's what Freud would call something like a parapraxis of hearing then, right? And they say, oh, German or Italian, right? And you use this story in multiple contexts to set up the way in which we are so allergic to taking fashion seriously, even as it's something that inflects all of our daily lives, and as it both shapes and reflects our deepest beliefs and anxieties. Your work on fashion has been field-defining, breaking new ground and opening up space for others to do this kind of rigorous work on fashion and to communicate that work to the public. And so in that light, and to invoke a word that we use a lot on this podcast, why do you think there's so much resistance or so many resistances to scholarly work on fashion and to generally taking fashion seriously? And I should say, this also includes within the field of psychoanalysis itself, the language of narcissism and this sort of specter of specifically female narcissism loom really large.
Yes, this has been one of the things that's intrigued me ever since I started studying fashion in graduate school. Why is it so dismissed? And when I'd interview professors and they wouldn't allow their names to be used discussing fashion.
Oh, wow.
And I think that it really has to do a lot with the idea that fashion is associated with bodies instead of minds. That people who are interested in fashion are stupid and they're vain. And also fashion is particularly associated with women, incorrectly in a way, because men certainly wear fashion too. But that association with women and with the body makes it seem less serious. It's something that also seems commercial. So it's bourgeois. It has so many negative connotations for, sort of left-thinking academics. It's a waste of time. It's non-utilitarian. It's purely about a kind of personal pleasure, which is very suspect. Then, of course, if you go to fashion people, they also are opposed to seriously studying fashion, which was weird to me because I was just getting used to the fact that academics despised my topic. And then I realized that fashion people also did, but for a different reason. For them, it was that they were afraid if you took fashion as a serious scholarly subject, you would take away the magic from it. It's as though you would pull the curtain aside and reveal the Wizard of Oz as the charlatan that he was. And so they really wanted to believe that fashion was magic, that, you bought something new by the right designer and it was a transformational object that would change everything. And then psychoanalysts, I think, also do resist it. And for some of the same reasons, this idea of narcissism, which is close to vanity, and female narcissism in particular. And even Lacan for all that he was personally interested in fashion, talks about the Procrustean arbitrariness of fashion, and in a way presents an almost feminist idea of how fashion is all about, fetishism, mutilation, pain, and that is a very strange perception to be coming from someone who, in fact, was so openly accepting of all kinds of eccentricities, and why particularly attack fashion as the sort of cause of fragmentation. So I think there are a lot of reasons why different people come together to decide that fashion is something frivolous, superficial, and only a few people have sort of circled around and go, well, only shallow people don't take, surface appearances seriously. And Lacan tilted towards that. I mean, there's a sense where he says, okay, it is on the surface that you can find all kinds of information about the unconscious. It's not, as Freud first envisioned, hidden away deep inside, but it's right on the surface where you find blushes and psychosomatic rashes and all kinds of somatic manifestations of unconscious conflicts. And I think with fashion, it's there too. Sometimes you're conscious of what you're wearing and why. If you go to a job interview, you wear a new suit, but a lot of times you're inadvertently revealing aspects that you might prefer to keep private.
That's so fascinating. And I should confess to you and to the listeners that the question of fashion never came up during my psychoanalytic training at all. Except, peripherally, in the sense that like someone was doing a case study and they mentioned that they'd accidentally revealed a tattoo or something when bending over to pick up a pen, and then the analysis was ruined, right? But even then, clothes were just sort of in the given and uninterrogated. Clearly, there were certain types of style that people favored. Serapes were really big for women in the period when I was doing this. But
you're dating yourself.
Yeah, I can do that. I'm fair with that. It's okay. But even, again, I'm blushing more than usual about this. But what I found myself realizing, and it was a properly uncanny but also distressing realization, which probably has a lot to do with my upbringing and about gender and many other things too. But even as someone with psychoanalytic commitments and who will profess that, there are no accidents in psychic life, right? That everything is meaningful, that we enter into sort of orders of meaning and semiotic systems that precede us, that we're always being interpolated in these things, and that appeals to efficiency and practicality and simple obviousness or social norms are always actually insufficient, that there's always something else going on there, that I had never in a sustained way thought about what I was wearing or what other people would wear systematically with that type of, well, call it suspicion, but also that type of critical faculty. And I think part of that too was a function also of miscategorizing, again, in an under-interrogated way, resistance on my own part, what sort of fashion meant. And I sort of associate that exclusively with what I would see on the runways or, in Oscar sort of coverage or something else like that. And simply having the fact that it just means clothes, or I'm not trying to reduce it, but just like the fact that what we wear or what we are told to wear is the province of fashion and fashion studies was a remarkable sort of revelation in its own right. And it made me both move beyond a lot of these sort of things that I've been taught, and that one finds in various figures, whether it's I'm thinking about Freud's wild lines about how knitting is about covering like female pudenda or whatever. Right? All these things, as you say in the book, like, do you have that experience where you don't have to truck with phallic symbolism if you don't want to? And I think Peter Gay's right about that. But just realizing that this is an ongoing dynamic thing that I have to relate to whether not
you want
I want
to or not. Yeah.
But it's very, very common with men. I've had many male journalists say to me, I'm not interested in fashion at all. It doesn't involve me. I don't wear brands. And I'm like, really? Does your mom buy your clothes for you? And they go, no, of course not. And I go, well, so you do choose them, right? They don't just grow on your apartment floor. And by the way, those jeans you're wearing, they are a brand. They're Levi's. That has a particular connotation. So, but you have to sort of really tease it out of them that, in fact, yes, they chose those clothes for some reason that they're not really in touch with.
Yeah.
And it makes me think, too, in this way about this desire for control, or this sort of difficulty of realizing that even among professionals in the analytic community who are very invested in depth psychology and everything is open for discussion, that unlike your utterances and interpretations in an analytic session, you are always broadcasting meaning by what you are wearing, whether you like it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And your choices about what you are wearing are structured by processes that exceed you and precede you and are kind of indifferent to your intentionality. On the one hand, that should be a thing that analysts are very warm to. On the other hand, it's profoundly destabilizing to have to confront that.
Well, and of course, some psychoanalysts do analyze their patients' clothes,
Yeah.
although it's sometimes very simple, like, well, she's incredibly disheveled and she's wearing long sleeves, so maybe she's been self-cutting again or something. It's a sort of limited kind of interpretation because there is no meaning inherent in the clothes. I mean, it's all a question of it being read and reread different times by different people. I myself, even after studying fashion for years, I always thought about fashion primarily in terms of sex and gender and identity. And it was only much later that I thought of fashion and clothing in terms of psychic protection, as kind of armor. And then that made perfect sense. But I was very, very slow to coming to that idea.
I'm very excited. We are going to talk about that later, but that is one of those things that I think of so much every time I put on clothes and walk into a classroom. Something like that. So we're definitely going to get into it. But first, can you tell us about the upcoming exhibition at the Museum of FIT, Dress, Dreams, and Desire, Fashion and Psychoanalysis? And I wanted to ask a little bit about the origins of the show, about how you understand psychoanalysis and fashion as mutually illuminating each other. And perhaps if you wanted to tell us about some pieces in the show that you're especially excited about.
Sure. The show grew out of working on the book. And at first, I started it during the pandemic and we were sent home. And I was reading and reading and reading. And I thought maybe there can be a show in this. But it was a very slow process. I'd read a lot of Freud before, but then reading Lacan, Anzieu, and others. And at the same time, choosing which clothes might be suitable to use as a concrete example of a particular psychoanalytic idea. So for example, interpretation of dreams. That's probably the commonest thing that people know. They've heard that Freud has, sex and dream theories and that Jung had dream theories. So you can go, all right, we have this dress in the collection by Jeremy Scott from Moschino, where the dress is like a chocolate bar. And so it's really referring very clearly to, childhood pleasures and the sweet taste of candy and sort of you might say like the original oral pleasure about sucking at the breast. But also by making a dress, it's sort of implying that the woman wearing it is not only as a chocolate bar in this kind of phallic shape, but that she's also good enough to eat. And so you've got all kinds of sexual innuendos woven into this. And then if you look at Jung's dream theory, it's not about sexual wishes or the pleasure principle. It's more about the collective unconscious and, universal archetypes. And so there are lots of feminine archetypes like the queen and the lover. But Rick Owens did a collection called Priestesses of Longing. And we took something from that and go like, well, the priestess, that's an interesting kind of esoteric feminine archetype with occult overtones. And, maybe you could interpret this dress sort of in a Jungian way. Not saying that the designers were thinking that, not saying this is the meaning of either dress, but just saying this would be an interesting way if you could put up clothes and say, this is one way you could look at it through the lens of psychoanalytic theory. Or another dress that I bought for the museum by Jun Takahashi of Undercover was from a collection that was covered with images of roses and razor blades. So that's very much part of his theme of having things that are pretty or cute, but also things that are scary. And so I thought, well, you could interpret it as being sort of about Eros and Thanatos, and maybe even the idea that you need destruction in order to create something new. So more sort of Sabina Spielrein that maybe than Freud himself.
Yeah.
So those were some examples. Or, well, of course, having struggled with Lacan, the mirror stage, I really, really wanted to get Elsa Schiaparelli's mirrored jacket, from her Zodiac collection in 1939 with the fractured mirrors on it, to talk about, the sense of being fractured and the idea that, Lacan would say, you think your ego ideal is whole when you look in the mirror, but that's a total delusion. And other psychoanalysts saying, let's not call it false. You need a certain degree of narcissism to survive in the world. So I thought, I've got to get that. And I managed to find a private collector who would lend me that one. Of course, I wanted some very obvious ones like Versace. I wanted the safety pin dress, and
Yeah.
I wanted the Jennifer Lopez dress, and I got those, which are all sort of about, the object of desire and sexual difference. And then I wanted, what else? Oh, well, Victor and Rolf did this amazing couture collection about emotions during the pandemic. And one of them was this
these
big
images were
coat
incredible.
with spikes coming out of it. And there's a voiceover of the way they used to have at fashion shows going, "You're angry. You have a right to be angry." So I wrote this little section in the wall text for the exhibit. I think it came pretty much after the book, where I'm talking about ugly feelings and feelings of anger that can sometimes also mean sadness. I mean, sometimes we don't even know what emotions we're feeling.
That Victor and Rolf piece in particular also kind of looks like the coronavirus.
Yes,
like
it does, doesn't it?
spikiness
It's
of
so
it.
fabulous.
Yeah. Talk about overdetermination. Talk about an image that you could just kind of, read and read and reread, both in terms of, what it signifies, but also the kind of feelings that it generates.
That was a wonderful piece. I wanted to buy that for the museum, and the Victor and Rolf people said, well, someone else is interested in it. And it turned out it was the Phoenix Art Museum, and they said, sure, you can borrow it for your show.
Oh,
nice.
So that was great. Cost less than bringing it in from Europe.
Amazing. I mean, I wanted to talk about going to see fashion in a museum as opposed to encountering it in a shop window or on the runway. The thing that comes up for me, actually, I'm thinking about this is a while back, but I was thinking about the Heavenly Bodies exhibit at the Met, and just what an incredible experience that was to walk into that. Because if I'm looking at medieval papal vestments, I'm not like, will I be wearing this? Right. And which is also true of the Victor and Rolf, spiky, I don't even, is it a dress? Is it
It's a coat.
It's a coat. I was like, it's an outfit. It's a mood. It's many things. But you're not looking at these things in the mode of, will I buy them, or even, will this work for me? Right? You're seeing it as art. You're seeing it in historical context. Whether it is, the Scaparelli mirror jacket, or whether it is, these elaborate medieval vestments. But as you write about in the book, most of us do interact with clothing in the mode of consumption, including overconsumption, right? Which is particularly rich, I think, for a variety of psychoanalytic thinkers. And so, one of the first book of yours that I read was Fetish. So you've written a book about clothing and fetishism, and both that book and the current book and exhibition include discussions of what Marx called the fetishism of the commodity. And we are not going to do a whole sidebar on commodity fetishism, but put very briefly, we treat objects, including clothing, as valuable in themselves, while obscuring what it is that makes them truly valuable, the human labor that brought them into being. And so I loved, and I wanted to read this passage from you. Quote, Kleinian analysts suggest that the consumption of goods ultimately refers back to the baby's experience of incorporating the good breast, that is, the nourishment and pleasurable sensations associated with nursing. If we are stressed or anxious, we may smoke or eat too much, or try to fill psychic hunger with greedy shopping. We project our idealized selves onto consumer goods and then reintroject these idealized objects. Buying consumer goods provides gratification, at least in the short term, because it gives a feeling of agency while also acting as a defense against bad feelings, close quote. So can you talk to us a bit about the ways that the pleasures of fashion, and there are many, right? But that the pleasures of fashion both are and are not intertwined with the pleasures of consumption, and about how you think psychoanalysis can help us understand those pleasures.
Right. Well, I think some of the pleasures definitely are associated with consumption and with novelty. The idea that you're buying, in effect, a new and up-to-date skin, that in a sense, you're becoming a new person. And unfortunately, it wears off pretty fast. Very often it wears off even before you've gotten home.
Yeah.
We once had someone who was a psychiatrist who would give us expensive clothes, designer clothes that still had the tags on them. She got buyer's remorse when she got them home, but instead of returning them, she just donated them to us. So I think this obsession with novelty, which is so wrapped up in fashion, and of buying, of feeling better when you're buying things, and that can be a lot of people. It's a hobby, it's a way of filling time too. It's probably the root cause, or one of the main root causes, of the terrible environmental and social impact of fashion. We don't know how to value human labor because we don't see the clothes being made anymore. So it used to be, in Dante's time, you'd bring the cloth to a tailor, he'd be sewing it, you'd be making these decisions. It would be something that you would see and participate in, but you don't anymore. Some people have suggested that, to some extent, if you could at least mend or make some of your own clothes, or get involved with some kind of long-term relationship with a local designer, you might be able to help with some of this sort of destructive overconsumption. A professor at FIT told me the other day that he asked his students to go in their closet and come back with the number of clothes they had. And he said, people are like, I have 70 pairs of jeans. And at this point, you go like, oh my God, what's so out of control?
In a New York City apartment?
It's devoted to the clothes. I mean, it's sort of like Happy Victims, that book about Japanese shoppers where the tiny apartment were filled with clothes. But another person suggested that maybe the experience of focusing more on wearing clothes and your feelings about clothes also would help, rather than focusing so much on the way you looked in clothes and showing off the look. I mean, a lot of people buy clothes, take selfies, post those, and then return the clothes. I mean, it's a kind of almost like bulimic approach to consumption. But it's definitely a problem, because there's no question that it can feel really gratifying when you find what seems like, "Oh, finally the perfect object, that the dress that's going to make you look really just right," and then find that, a week later you have it in the bag in the closet and you kind of go, why did I buy that?
Yeah. I mean, it is this experience. I mean, and I think we've probably, well, I don't know, Patrick, you don't have the same thing. You're not like stalking the perfect item on the real real the way that I am sometimes. But there is that sense of, it's a beautiful dramatization of Lacan's theory of desire, right? The moment you get the object that has structured your desire, you still feel that lack.
It's just a substitute for another loss. And what's interesting to me is when Lacan suggests that the kind of objects that you want tend to be objects that other people desire.
Yes.
So that, I think, is linked in too with all these influencers and with brands. So it's not even that you're identifying with brand X and saying, that's me,
Mhm.
finally a designer who understands me. It's really like, a lot of people now are into brand X, therefore I will buy it.
Yeah. One thing that sometimes makes me think that Lacan was really wrong about this is I have a couple of pieces where every time I pick them up, I'm like, this is exactly right. I feel exactly like myself. Like I
Yes.
have the perfect leather jacket that I've had for 13 years.
Yes.
And every time I put it on, and this is armor, certainly, but I
Yes.
feel a little bit more like I coincide with myself.
That is a very good feeling. And there's no question, I think, that most people have at least a few clothes in that overpacked closet that are the ones they go to time and again, because those ones are fairly guaranteed to make them feel good.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to try and figure out why.
Yeah.
I mean, I was wearing one of those things once, and the husband of a friend of my husband said, "Oh, you look just like a ninja." And I thought, oh my God, I never thought I wanted to look like a ninja, but that's perfect. And that's no wonder I like this thing. It's, it is just there I am, powerful, invisible. There it is. We've got it.
That's so funny.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, because the ninja isn't supposed to be seen, right? They're tossing the smoke bombs and throwing the shuriken and then flee. There's so many paradoxes in this, but they're paradoxes rather than aporias, right? They move something forward or they capture something. And I can't help but think in a distinctively Lacanian vein here about this sort of, well, I guess he'd use the word of like capture or an investment in a image of totality or in a fantasy of totality that the right ensemble will give you. And the French, you're in also you're in your own skin, right? You put it in and you feel like yourself, and you're feeling yourself, as it were, to be idiomatic. But then you get home or you're halfway out the shop and you are like, oh, this is just asymptotically close. I have to go back again to the well. And I admit a type of, I feel bad for that psychiatrist who couldn't enjoy her own symptom and had to be donating the clothes away immediately instead of wearing them.
I know we kind of hoped that she would never be cured, but she disappeared. So maybe she managed to deal with that some other way.
Became a ninja, as it were. I think it's a theme that I find myself encountering here is sort of this, again, this sort of paradox or this movement or kind of dialectic between the desire to authentically embody yourself.
Yeah.
Naturally, yet it has to be done through artifice. And it's always about, much in the same way as the mirror is made by other people and the child's and the little, the truck baby, like little walker, it's always mediated. It's always about the gaze of the other, even when you are most authentically being yourself. And that sort of paradox between, well, this is me. I am in the given. Here I am. I'm ready for the world. And the difficulties of the gaze of the other, or even of like the commodity chain and the way in which this thing that you take as a gestalt that is you and that has arrived has actually been contingently produced by all these others is a properly existential set of paradoxes.
Well, I mean, I would question whether there is any kind of authentic self that you're showing at all, whether it isn't always a persona. But I know once I finally was able to plow through enough Lacan and talk to enough people who could explain it to me, I was very impressed by his whole idea about the mirror stage and the gaze. And then when I discovered Didier Anzieu and his idea about the skin ego, which sort of has given a lot of fashion scholars a new way to look at that metaphor of fashion as a second skin, the two of them really fit together so well. I mean, back when I wrote my doctoral dissertation on fashion and eroticism, I sort of said, the really erotic parts of the body are not erogenous zones. They're, the eye and the skin, and the brain. And then recently I was reading, I'll just read the quote from her. It's a contemporary psychoanalyst, Pascal Navari, and she wrote, "What the look of fashion exposes is simultaneously our vulnerability about being seen and not being seen." And then she went on and talked about how fashion makes us visible to an indifferent world while also providing us with protective dark glasses that hide our vulnerability. And I thought that was really a cool way of thinking about it, that, it's not just about, here I am, look at me, but also, but only look at me in the right way, and if you're not going to look at me in the right way, then I have to have something that's going to protect me.
Well, I want to talk about two different ways of thinking about fashion that aren't just about the gaze. And I'm hoping we can get more into this idea of the skin ego too, because that was something that was new to me. Didier Anzieu is on my to read list for sure coming up. But one section of the book that I personally resonated with was about two ways of imagining clothes that I think seem kind of incompatible at first blush. Clothing is something that gives tactile pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And then clothing is armor, which you already alluded to before. Yeah. And so, full disclosure, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Elsa Schiaparelli.
Yes, okay.
I laughed a lot because I actually really like Sonia Rykiel. I was like, and so you put together Sonia Rykiel with Elsa Schiaparelli, who is this theorist of the self-caress par excellence. And you also bring up this concept from Didier Anzieu of the skin ego in talking about this tactile pleasure of self-relation. And in connection with the second way of thinking about clothing as armor, you quote this wonderful line from Yoji Yamamoto, who I also love but cannot afford, unlike Sonia Rykiel, who says, "I make clothing like armor. My clothing protects you from unwelcome eyes." And so both thinking of clothing in terms of tactile pleasure and this idea of clothing as this kind of defensive armature, they seem to share this striking refusal to think of fashion and also thus of the self as existing primarily for the gaze of the viewer. And I mean, I would suggest also, apropos of something you were saying a few minutes ago, that they both militate against a sense of like clothing as helping you arrive at some sort of fundamental sense of authenticity that, you know, is never really to be found. So I'm hoping you can tell us more about these two ways of understanding clothing and how psychoanalytic thinking helps us better understand the role of fashion, both as a resource for this kind of pleasurable, tactile relationship to the self and perhaps to others, and also about fashion as this kind of armor. I mean, as we venture out into the world, I think of like Wilhelm Reich's idea of character armor here.
Yes.
Also in this connection.
Well, I mean, again, Anzieu talks a lot about how the skin ego is like a psychic fantasy in a way for the infant. It's like holds together who you are, just as the real skin holds your body together, keeps your insides from falling out. The skin ego holds you the way a mother would hold a baby, and also protects you, just as your skin offers at least some protection against, punctures or scrapes, etc. So clothing then is like an interface between you, what's inside of you, what you feel is inside of you, and the world and other people in the world. And clothes, if you take it as clothing as metaphorically the second skin, which is like a kind of material skin ego, you can put it on to sort of re-narcissize yourself if you feel like you're falling apart. It's like a piece of extra maternal skin, a shield that will hold you. And some designers also talk about this reassuring holding part, which you get so much of from child psychoanalysts, from Winnicott on to Esther Bick. Albert Elbaz, who used to be the designer for Lanvin, he said he wanted his clothes to be like a hug. And you can imagine how a cocoon coat would gently hold you, and the other things would be more overtly protective, like a leather jacket is really like it's physical and psychic protection. And other things we talk generally that the perfect little black dress is like armor to face the world. So again, it's not that it's physically protective like the leather coat, but it offers with those dark glasses that make you seem invulnerable. So I think that if you think of the clothing as being like this kind of an outer layer that enables you to react to the world, you're going to react in some cases with love and affection, and other cases people are not going to be so loving and affectionate towards you, and you need to have a way to cope with them too.
I'm thinking here about I have an abiding interest in sort of militaria and certain constructions of masculinity in our present moment, and this sort of these strange formations of like operator chic, right? And you have to say, oh, it's all modular. Everything has to be snappable. You have to be ready to get tactical at any given moment, even if all you're doing is just going to the mall, right? And of course that extends to even like the accessory that is like the gun or something too. But in some ways, what that seems to, again, like it's in your face. It's right there on the surface, but in the way like the purloined letter is, like it's right on it's right in the say, it's right up there. It's immediately visible, and thus it's ignored. It seems that so much of that aesthetic in particular is a kind of like, it's a security blanket, I guess, or it's like
Yeah.
it bespeaks a type of
Cocoon.
insecurity. Yeah. And I mean, I do know people who, have worked in various branches of the service or whatever. And sometimes they will be posting selfies and they'll be like, here are some pants that I finally found some Dockers that I can wear at the field office, but that also won't split down the seam when I have to kick open a door. Right. And, good for them, I guess. But also on another level, it seems to be a case in point of dramatizing how so many of the choices that we make in terms of what we wear, or even the choices that we make without even thinking that we make them, are quintessentially, and here's a good psychoanalytic term, they're compromise formations.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think Flugel is so old-fashioned, who wrote about fashion in the 1920s and in 1930, but it was really correct when he said clothing is a compromise. He talked specifically about between exhibitionism and then repression of that, whether internal or external repression. You can't run around naked. But clothing is a kind of compromise between one's own desires and what other people are demanding or what they might demand. And the thing is, you have no control over how other people are going to look at you, or very little control. So this is one way to try and exert some. But even then, it's, as we know from rape trials, the prosecutors will say, like, well, but she was wearing this, so how can you accuse him of anything? You can't control it. And that, I think, is very unnerving.
We read Flugel a few weeks ago. So we just read The Psychology of Clothes because we did an episode on Sex in the City. And we got into your book on the fetish book, the section on high heels,
yes,
as well. But Patrick, the men's dress reform movement just like blew his mind.
The photos were lots of shorts. I appreciate a good short, but even then it seemed, as it was all about sort of efficiency and comfort and allowing things to breathe, clearly it wasn't just about that.
No. And the more you read about Flugel, and he was into eugenics and thought basically ideally the future would be completely nude, and you would have these bodies that would be wonderful. So you wouldn't need the clothing compromise of, say, covering up less beautiful aspects of you. So yes, the question is what's lacking and what's wrong, because a lot of times we're trying to use clothing for that as well, to kind of cope with that.
Yeah, you can, to the extent that your like personal financial resources permit it. And also depending on what kind of body you're in, what is available to you, you can make really deliberate choices.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And there is to be like, yesterday was my first day of classes, and I walked in and one of my colleagues was laughing. She was like, "Of course you're wearing all black." And I was like, "What else would I wear on the first day of classes?"
The end of the summer.
Which is like you can take the girl out of New York, but there's something ridiculous about it, because at the end of a long day of teaching, you're completely covered in white chalk dust. It's not really, but it's armor, but it is one of those sorts of things that it's like, well, you can make these very deliberate choices. And, we have the technology now you can change your hair. You can I don't even totally understand the world of like injectables and just the enormous amount of modifications you can make to your body. But fundamentally, you don't choose your mode of embodiment. If you watch someone looking in the mirror, you're always seeing them trying to please themselves, right? And there's always going to be this gap between what you want to project and what is given, right? We've talked before when we were talking about Flugel about this sort of like, well, we don't coincide with ourselves. And that is like one of the great pleasures of fashion, is to do a kind of self-fashioning that might help you asymptotically approach that. But then one of the great tragedies is that you will never arrive there.
Right. And fashion being, of course, much more than clothes, but all kinds of self-fashioning, from bodybuilding to hair dyeing to tattoos. Everyone's like fashions their body in multiple ways. There was a great one, the fashion writers, Lucia Ruggiero and Renata Strauss, did an article where they talked about, called The Deceptive Mirror. And they talked about Anti-Oedipus, the Deleuze and Guattari book. And they suggest that, quote, "We do not desire clothes as objects we lack, but it's bodies we want to couple with to go out in the world, which was kind of a fabulous way of, instead of looking at it from a lacking point of view, to look at it almost as this kind of a sexual act, that you're choosing the clothes that you think will be the best partner for you to go out on the first day of class or whatever it is you're doing.
Which also reminds me of another way of thinking about things, not in terms of lack, but sometimes, I mean, this is not, this is maybe less true in the era of fast fashion, but I'm thinking about some of the things that like I love in my closet are my mother's, right? And there's a way in which, you know, I'll say here's a specific, my family moved, I grew up in Chicago. My family moved to we're still on the East Coast, but my family moved to California. And at a certain point I said, Mom, you don't need that shearling coat anymore. And I really do. And she was like, it's too big for you. And I said, coats are big this season. And she said, oh, they really are. And now when it's cold, I am in Philly or New York and I wear my mother's shearling coat and I'm very toasty. But also I do feel hugged, and it's, you know what I mean? Like that's another way, like are these modes of relation.
Yes.
I think also that can be, you know, those aren't about fantasies of what you want the self to be necessarily. They can also be about like inheritance from the past and, you know, maintenance of ongoing emotional bonds. I mean, I think we often think about jewelry more in this connection.
Yes. Well, I mean, and feelings refer both to sensations and to emotions.
Yes.
And I think those often get confused or conflated. They can fit together.
Yeah.
I'm so taken with this idea of thinking about clothing under the sign of something other than just lack.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And to be clear, I think the lack stuff's very much there, whether we have French commitments and via the Lacanians, or also, you know, I think there's some stuff in Freud too, this whole idea of like prosthesis, right? When the child puts on all this armature, man is wonderful, but he's still, you know, the raiment, I don't know what the German is there, but it doesn't quite fit, right? So even as we sort of dress up with someplace to go, we are left, it indexes something that we don't have or something that we wish we could be. And yet at the same time, there does seem to be, as Abby is describing, as if you said, there's something that is more than the sum of its parts and more than just a struggle to achieve an impossible self-cohesion in putting something on that works for you or does something for you or makes something possible that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And it's interesting in the examples you gave, Abby, how that all involves sort of the other and this the mother specifically. It feels very a transitional object sort of in that way, right?
You never grew out of that.
But it also seems to relate to another one of these sort of paradoxes or these dialectical movements between sort of hiding and revealing or engaging the other or drawing the other in. And I the line that's rattling around in my head here is that bit, I think it's in Barth's Camera Lucida, where he talks about Mapplethorpe photos. And he's like, well, actually, the best part about Mapplethorpe's erotica is that everyone is wearing some sort of cotton undergarment, right? And the idea there, like, what makes it really sexy is the fact that you can't see everything. And the thing that you can't see there is not like the horror of absence or the horror of castration, right? You don't think, oh my God, there's nothing there.
It's just a tease. You want to, Freud said, on concealment, you want to like, that arouses curiosity. You want to peel it off. Or the wonderful quote by Musil from The Man Without Qualities, where he talks about even a person, you know, devoid of shame back in 1900 would have thought they were just renouncing all the civilized sexual excitement of clothes. They wanted to be like this little slender creature that was being sought for underneath all of the layers of clothing, that you were searching and looking for that, reaching that. So yes, I think there are ways that it's not just a lack in the body, but this some of the eroticism of the body, and maybe also some of the deathliness of the body that rubs off onto clothes. I mean, and I do think there's so many connections too with this refashioning about a way of maybe denying death or coming to grips with death, that somehow, just like the king is dead, long live the king. Each season with fashion, it's new. It's like that fashion is dead, but this fashion is new. Fashion is reborn. Like Cocteau said, you must forgive fashion everything because it dies so young. It's always being reborn.
So a phrase that this leads me to think about is this idea then of not just of mediations or of limits in the sense of like a constraint, but rather as a condition of a kind of possibility, and the continual putting things on, not just to have to do it again then the next day or to take it off, but to somehow engage in some way. Like there's something about self-mediation in relation to the other through the mechanism of, donning this other dermis that seems on the one hand to very much be about control, but it's also about a type of openness or connection. In any event, I guess what I'm trying to point to is this sort of dialectic between, on the one hand, like covering things up, and on the other hand, revealing, but that is even when it has this sort of noli me tangere kind of thing. I think about like the punks, right? They're all, they got that, like the spikes, and like don't look at me, look at me, right?
Right.
Or like, how dare you look at me, buddy, look at me. But
Right.
that there's something tentative and fundamentally other oriented in how it involves the self that seems to suggest something very profound about how the self is always related to the other.
Right. Well, and you mentioned Barth. I mean, Barth talked about, the allure of the striptease as being associated with the object of desire. It's there, it's not there, it's there, it's not there. And so maybe in a sense, there's a fetishistic aspect, which is maybe at the heart of all eroticism. And then I remember there was a wonderful conversation between Linda Nochlin, the great feminist art historian, and Thierry Mugler, who is a great creator of very outrageous fetishy fantasy fashions that turned women into, all kinds of insects, mermaids, fembots. And a lot of feminists didn't like them in the 80s and 90s when he was making these clothes. And she said, the great designer of clothing is always providing additional disguises to create new forms of the feminine. And I thought this was such a cool idea that, it's a disguise not for hiding, but a disguise for revealing a new aspect of oneself that you might not have realized was there until it was created.
Yeah, and that's such a remarkable contrast, I think, to some of the like more quotidian ways that people think about dressing themselves. Like, you want to cover up certain problem area. I'm not endorsing this, obviously, but I do think we think often in terms of concealing for the purposes of shame,
Of
right?
course, clothing is, among other things, a shame guard. You know,
Yeah.
it's trying to protect you from other people looking contemptuously at you.
Yeah, and I'm thinking now because we're kind of in this we're back in this moment of like extreme thinness for a whole host of cultural and political reasons that would take
Yep.
us at least another 2 hours to even scratch the surface of. But let's just stipulate it for a moment. And for those of us like Patrick and I, we lived through. Not all of our listeners will have lived through like the Kate Moss and heroin chic moments. But those things are very much back. And I think so much of this sort of sense of the shaping of the self is about the shaping of the self to become smaller. And of course, this is an issue in the fashion industry with, not only with models specifically, but with people who are, looking at, I guess, when I grew up, it was fashion magazines, but now it's Instagram
Mhm.
and other ways
Yeah.
of it circulating. But when you think about, and I actually really do admire Mugler a lot, and I'm thinking about like Laverne Cox's like
Yes.
well-known
Yes.
fondness for Mugler is like, these are whole new shapes.
Yes.
Instead of necessarily wanting to just like shrink the self or to be like, let's cinch the waist, right? Like, let's make sure we use the rule of thirds and divide you up into the most like quote unquote flattering proportions. Like, let's make you an alien. Or
Mhm.
like, let's make, instead of trying to have this feminine, like hourglass silhouette, and you have like these very demure kinds of things, and let's make our shoulders fucking huge.
Yes.
Right. And how does that not only impact the way that the person who has donned that, you know, armature of the self, it's a sort of
Yes.
carapace in a
Yes.
way. How does that not only affect the way that you move through space, but also then how others see the possibilities of their own bodies? Right.
Yes.
I just think there's something I'm with Patrick on the sort of the play of revelation and concealment, but then there's this whole other register, which is, you know, going beyond something that's like just trying to like quote unquote enhance the human
Right.
form.
Right. I mean, silhouette can be about things which are making things strange and disturbing and interesting. And I think a lot of the best designers, Scaparelli, McQueen,
Yeah.
Mugler, they were doing that. And even, Flugel said, big clothes by taking up space. They're saying, look at me, pay attention to me. I mean, you metaphorically taking up space, you're like really sort of, okay, I'm here.
So let's talk about Scaparelli. I'm been very excited to do this. I think I mean, Lacan has already haunted this conversation, and I don't think it's going to surprise our listeners that Lacan, who is, you know, he's a theorist of the mirror, of the fragmentation of the self, and, you know, of course, of desire as something that is always already unfolding in the field of the other. So Lacan is this key figure for thinking about fashion psychoanalytically. And in your book, this comes really vividly into view in the example of Elsa Schiaparelli, who famously collaborated with Salvador Dali, who is also an associate of Lacan's. And so with Schiaparelli, we get into fashion that's not about, you know, quote unquote beauty in any sort of straightforward way. It can be about danger, it can be about fragmentation and destruction, whether it's this jacket covered with mirrors, or it's
Broken glass,
broken, yeah.
Yes, the mirrors have
Yes.
been broken. It's really powerful.
Broken mirrors, or I mean, I think some of our listeners will also know like the lobster dress.
Yes.
Scaparelli and others, you know, they make clothing it's not supposed to just be pretty. You know, it's not Lily Pulitzer, right?
Yeah.
It's supposed to disturb you. It's supposed to jar you, or at least it's supposed to shake you up, right, as a
Yes.
viewer. And so you, Valerie, you write about Scaparelli's suiting as something that invokes the phallic woman. And there's other examples that I think are really helpful.
I mean, she's hard. She talks about the wooden soldier silhouette with the
Yes.
broader shoulders and then the narrow waist. Disturbingly, in a way, she talks about how women should change their bodies to fit their clothes, which we go, ooh. But then it's true. She's not talking about idealizing. She's talking about living up to a kind of an image that she's creating that you could go into. You know, you might be stepping into a dress that turns you into a skeleton, for example,
Right.
based on the idea of a flayed skin. Um, so,
Yes.
or I mean, she does mostly Freudian things, dream symbolism, sexual symbolism, exhibitionism, and but there are hints of Lacanian ideas like mirror stage and sort of the body being fragmented. It's frustrating. I could never find out whether Dali ever introduced her to Lacan. Neither is mentioned in any
Mm.
never mentioned in a Scaparelli biography index, and vice versa. She's never mentioned in anything about Lacan. But she did have some awareness of psychoanalysis. And the way she talks in her autobiography, for example, she talks obsessively about mirrors. When she says at the very beginning, I only know Scaparelli because I've seen her in the mirror. And then later, a few pages later, I've seen her in the mirror. She talks about in Berlin, how in 1939 she's going down a stairway in Berlin and the wall is mirrored. And she goes, look, finally a smart woman. And her friend goes, for instance, don't you recognize
Wow.
yourself? And so mirrors and looking are obviously very fraught for her. She talks about how sometimes she will look through people when she's being mean. She'll just like look through them. They don't exist for her. And she talks about how her mother said constantly how ugly she was and how she did all these things to try and make herself beautiful, putting flower seeds up her nose and in her mouth to try and grow flowers. And so, I mean, I think
Wow.
the broken aspect is there, projected clearly in things like the mirrored jacket, but also there's an attempt to create something beautiful instead. I mean, the very zodiac collection was from her uncle, the astronomer, who'd said that the moles on her face were shaped like a particular constellation in the sky. So he was saying, unlike her mother who said, "You're so ugly, you're so ugly," her uncle's going, "Look how special you look, how beautiful you look." And I think a lot of fashion designers actually are trying to make beauty or make something that might be a strange beauty, an alternative beauty, as opposed to the conventional idealizing images of women or men.
Yeah, I was really interested in, I mean, it's not just Scaparelli that you talk about in terms of like the invocation of this phallic woman. I think another example that our listeners will probably be familiar with is the Gaultier cone bra that
Sure.
Madonna wears. And, I mean, I'm thinking also there's a military reference in there in a lot of
Yes,
ways. Like, it is like the breasts become weapons. I'm
absolutely.
interested in how Lacan helps us think about fashion, but more than that, because I think Patrick and I could tackle that. But what I think we really want to ask you is, how does the world of fashion and the examples from this world, specific pieces, specific designers, their worldviews, what they're up to, their projects, how do those also help us understand Lacan better? Because it seems to me that this is one of those things where these two terms, fashion and psychoanalysis, are really in this dynamic tension. And one of the things that I found so powerful about the book is how, Lacan is notoriously hard to understand. Scaparelli's mirror jacket is like makes visible this idea in a way that, we spent 8 hours doing 4 episodes on the mirror stage. And it's like, I have that sort of like, she just tweeted it out, but I mean, kind of feeling.
Well, I think
Yeah.
the cool thing about fashion is that it's concrete. They're objects that you can see and you can look at, whereas Lacan is notoriously talking at a plane of extreme abstraction. And sometimes you wonder if he's thinking he's talking like through the voice of the unconscious. It's sort of like, what are you saying? But if you look at Gautier's Coimbra dress, it's like well, really the breasts are just like they're ready to poke your eyes out. These are clearly a very powerful statement, and one that he talked about, Madonna being someone who plays the game of femininity. And Mugler also talks about, no, he didn't do psychoanalysis, but he did another kind of psychotherapy, and he's interested in how men also can play the game of masculinity, which of course Lacan was very much like, oh, fashion is a feminine form. And in Alison Bancroft's book, she goes, oh, no, it's all feminine. It's feminine. Men don't have a masculine masquerade. But you have these designers who are going, yeah, they can. Maybe most men are this sort of unmarked denial. We're not in fashion. We just wear things that are practical. But certainly the kind of men who were wearing Gautier and Mugler, and these people were definitely making a kind of a masculine masquerade fairly self-consciously. And the designers were talking about that. And I mean, we weren't able to get one of them, but if you think of Rick Owens did a show once where he had cutouts in the menswear show and men's limp penises were visible, and the press was like, "Oh my God!" And this was sort of like, "Okay, let's rip the veil back about men's fantasies that the penis is the phallus." I mean, this is kind of he was really like, "Nope, nope, sorry guys, it's mostly just a penis." And I think showing that, and it's not castrated, it's just not hard.
Something seems to be very profound, and this brings us back almost to what we opened with about the question of resistances
Mm-hmm.
and the psychic work that goes into sort of disavowing or not seeing the thing that's right in front of you. But I think about how when one one reads Lacan in the seminars, or one listens to some of the audio, such as it is, or even one works one's way through an analytic encounter, right? So much of that is about language. So much of that is so temporally attenuated. The words disappear, right? It's even if someone says something that sticks in your brain or that blossoms later through deferred action, it's sound waves in air. And at the risk of saying something that I hope isn't too obvious, but I guess maybe that's part of my role here because I really am out of my depth. the clothes are still there, right? They're materially present in this way that cannot be disavowed. They sort of insist on themselves. And in particular, as far as what we were just talking about, there is, and again, forgive me if I'm saying something that's so obvious, but perhaps it's lack of obviousness to me is part of maybe a case in point. But particularly when we think about gender, like thinking about fashion in any systematic way, no matter how much one has tried to puzzle over what exactly Lacan means about sexuation or what these diagrams are of the two bathrooms, etc., clothes are clearly artifacts that suggest that gender is constantly being dynamically constituted through differential processes, and it's always some type of ongoing investment or disinvestment or some sort of dialogue. It's not given. And that is hard to convey in language. And yet,
and just as psychoanalysis is really obsessed with sex and gender and keeps circling around them, fashion is also. I mean, a lot of fashion designers will say, oh, fashion's all about sex and attracting people. Others will play with the idea, well, we're going to do feminine, ultra feminine fashions here. This is going to be hyper masculine. It's going to be a new kind of masculinity. And in the last 15 years, there's been a lot more gender blend, gender fluid fashion. In the past, it was almost always women taking on men's fashion, and that was called androgyny and unisex, but it was really taking on men's fashion. As one lesbian put it in the 80s, when cock is king, go for the codpiece. You know, there's more prestige and power in men's clothes than in women's clothes. But now you're finding more men are wearing women's clothes. And of course, there's been, I think, the beginning of a real paradigm shift in the way younger people are thinking about sex and gender. I think that gender fluid clothes have a lot to do with the greater awareness of not just queer people, but trans people, and that's a really important issue. And a lot of the old school Lacanians, like really, even all the talking about the phallus, penis, phallus, what's the difference? It's maybe you should just call it the X factor. That's like people want X. If they want to have it or they want to be it. And so many of psychoanalysts are still have learned nothing from his history of homophobia and misogyny. And they're still like arguing that trans people have to like accept reality and accept their body the way they were born into it without recognizing that in many ways, you could say that neither the body nor the self is a kind of given fixed entity, that everybody becomes who they are through a constant process of self-fashioning. And in fact, that fashion itself in terms of clothing and other aspects like accessories also help all of us to say who we are. That it's not just, as Patricia Geravici said, it's not just trans people who have gender trouble. Everybody has gender trouble.
Yeah.
And fashion is one of the ways that, along with narrative, are two of the ways that you fashion who you are and who you want to be.
I was really struck reading your book, and this is another essay that I have bookmarked to read. So I knew a little bit about Joan Riviere, but not about her essay on the masquerade and the female masquerade. But I was really struck by how much that was like Judith Butler before Judith Butler.
Oh yeah, it's fascinating. And she published that in 1929.
Incredible.
She was one of a whole cohort of women who got excited about psychoanalysis in the 1920s, when it really seemed to be about what is it to be a woman? What's women's sexuality like? It seemed to be promising that it wasn't just about maternity and marriage. All these women were having professions, including the profession of psychoanalysis. And whereas Flugel's going like, yay, women's clothes prove that they're less repressed and they're more liberated. And men, come on, catch up with women. And Riviere goes, well, no, it's great. There's all of these professional women, who can be wives and mothers too, and they're good at their profession, but they're still facing so much male hostility that they have to kind of put on this masquerade of femininity with clothing and dress, flirting and joking and pretending that, oh, just because I'm giving a lecture, don't take me seriously. I'm still a girl, And so this kind of masquerade, and then she says that's the same thing as real femininity, is that it's always the masquerade.
It's all masquerade. It's masquerade all the way down.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was totally fascinating. And it really made me think. I mean, I had a question queued up for you about gender fluidity and you've already covered so much of it here. And I was thinking also about the ways in which what goes under the name of androgyny is mostly women wearing what have historically been men's
Overwhelmingly, yeah.
clothes overwhelmingly. And we are in this moment where we're seeing on red carpets. I'm thinking about Timothy Chalamet's like red halter
Yes, of
top
course.
moment, thinking about Billy Porter. And these are, some of them are great looks, right? Also, in addition to like their many meanings. But I do think when we're talking sometimes about the way that fashion helps or hinders in terms of self-fashioning, to go back to the like Riviere and Butler of it all, um, that takes fashion to be something that is purely an expressive function, right? That like you have this interior self and then you put on these clothes and then there it is, you've communicated it to the world and it's like, but it's so much more complicated than that.
Yeah, doesn't work that way. It's much more like you find out who you are by dressing up as a something. I remember this fetish photographer said to me once, "You wear it, you become it." And I think, that in a lot of ways, and you see it more clearly maybe with some queer and trans people, that it helps to enact who you feel you are becoming. You sort of on the runway of life, and it helps create a sense of pride through visibility,
Mhm.
that you're not, sort of hiding things, but in fact you're experimenting with playing them out in a visual way. Obviously it can be dangerous in the real world, when but that's the same way that unveiled women in Afghanistan, or we anybody who is in a environment which is transphobic or homophobic. And I think phobic's not even the right word. We're talking about a kind of really irrational hatred, that then it can be dangerous. But there's so many positive aspects too, to the idea of going public with who you are
Mm.
in the process of becoming, not an inner self, but you're sort of acting it out, you become something. That's really more what people are doing. And you see teenagers do it all the time.
I
It's
was
just they're
just
becoming
thinking that.
this and they're like playing this out. And then older people tend to be like, okay, this is who I am, I guess,
This returns me to what we opened with, and to you're right. Still, I'm going to be processing this for a while, but the appeal to the commitment, even among analysts, in a kind of Cartesian mind body dualism, and in the culture more generally, where it's like, well, the clothes are just epiphenomenal to, I guess, like your res cogitans or whatever, right? It's just part of the extenso that you put on. But there is this other element here too, which I think is another thread, pardon the pun, that's been running through this conversation of a type of both like vulnerability and possibility, or something very complicated happening in terms of contingency of the world that we're kind of brought into and the orders that we are interpolated into, and agency that we have to sort of reconfigure our position in relation to those things, and in that change those things overall.
yes.
And it it seems to me that part of what is at stake here, or part of what reading your book and been thinking about the exhibit and just talking with you now, is really highlighting, and it's underscored, I think, too, by the example, which again, this is news to me, but that women dressing as men, all bracket quotes, scare quotes around that, is called androgyny, or has been called androgyny. Just, case in point, right? The unmarked norm is actually masculine,
Yes.
right? And this, in a similar mode, seems to bear on this sort of idea that the thing that is unremarkable, the thing that is given as being, well, just look at the clothes you wear, is actually a highly studied, highly contingent site of choices, of enforcement mechanisms, of codes, of risk.
Yeah.
And I also confess that I had not been familiar with this aspect of Riviere's work as well. I knew her from her work with Klein, but something that I almost want to gesture to sort of traverse this distinction between the mind and body, but also between like the public and the private, which may be another thing, sort of a binary that people are very invested in too, and sort of maintaining, well, there's me as I go out and perform it, and then there's me as I am at home, right? That this is
in my sweatpants.
Yeah, exactly. Look, I wear technical like REI shirts most of the day because I work from home. So I'm sorry, but there is this kind of lesson or a wisdom, I think, in a lot of psychoanalytic thought that prompts us to traverse both these things and point to our fundamentally embodied interdependence and the contingency of our own like ability to move and make choices in the world. And Riviere is a thinker of what we would call like reparation, or what the reparation concept, broadly construed via her and Klein, seems to gesture at, is a sort of attempt to stake a claim on being in the world as a person that is not just about contending with a lack that's in you or making good a lack that is in the other, but that is a type of sort of recognition and relating that produces more than just negativity, or that produces more than just a reflection of what's not there. It's a type of, again, agential working within limits of capitalism, of death, of our bodies, of the gender dress codes that are given to us in a given moment, to have some movement room, to have some space, to have a possibility for encounter.
It's about agency, but not about unlimited power. I mean, it's like Marx said, man makes, his future, but he doesn't make it just exactly the way he wants to.
Yeah.
And I think, when you mentioned Timothy Chalamet, I see that the unmarked male body, which is the norm, but it's a body which is very much most of the time protected under a layer of clothing. We understand, we pay attention to the fact that women are covered up, in authoritarian regimes. They're covered up. You don't want to see their body. But men are often even more covered up.
Yes.
They're in a tuxedo. The woman's in like very, body exposing clothes. When Chalamet showed off so much of his skin on a red carpet, when all the men are normally covered up completely, it was really fascinating. And I discovered that Gaultier had designed almost an identical jumpsuit years before, but even an enfant terrible like Gaultier, when he showed it on the runway, he showed it with a shirt underneath it and the guy carrying a jacket over his arm, because the naked upper back was too shocking on a man. What would it imply? Entry from behind or something? It seems that a nakedness in a male is really threatening because it shows how vulnerable the body is, which just again, these are for the most part bodies that are very fit, but still potentially, there's the vulnerability about the body.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, you look at Timothy Chalamet and those things, and he looks actually like euphoric. I was thinking about how we were talking in the connection of both Riviere and Butler before about how expressivity is insufficient, or just like not the right word for thinking about what donning something in service of trying out an identity. But, another way to think about this that is really in the affective register is like dysphoria, because clothing can certainly.
Yeah, we talk a lot about
on,
desire for fashion.
Yeah.
Don't talk about all the ugly feelings that fashion also evokes, like envy or anxiety.
Yes.
We talk about shopping as retail therapy, but some studies have shown that when you talk to people who are shopping for clothes, the feeling that they most feel is anxiety.
Right.
They're like, am I going to find something that will help me fit in? Or envy, that people are projecting envy onto others, so they'll wear envy-making clothes. They're all envying me, whereas the person is really envying others.
Yeah, but I think about both dysphoria and euphoria, both of which you can think of in terms of, gender dysphoria and gender euphoria, as those are some of the kind of, signals that one gets from the self that is like, yes, this is the thing that, even if there is no, fundamental authentic self that can be pinned down and exists forever and ever, but this registers for me, that we can mark it with those sorts of affective signals. Yeah.
At least you didn't talk about jouissance. We'd have to think about the pleasure pain of fashion. What are we talking about? High heels?
We didn't get to high heels. That is true. Although we, I feel like we would, because so Patrick, in addition to, doing a certain amount of work on masculinity and he actually does work on gun studies. And
Ooh,
so the
fascinating.
gun heel.
Oh yeah, those Lagerfeld shoes were amazing. I like those.
Weren't those great?
Yeah. Sadly, I don't think they come in your size.
No, I'm a 12 wide, so I'm lucky to get what I can get. Is basically
You could get a custom-made pair, bootleg in Hong Kong.
We're going to have an extra tier add a new tier to the Patreon. Get Patrick
a pair of Glock boots,
Lagerfeld gun heels. Before we go, Valerie, we have many listeners in the New York City area, and a lot of them have indicated that they are very interested in this topic, and I would love for them to be able to go to the exhibition and also to the symposium that's associated. So can you tell them a little bit about when it is open, where the museum is, when the symposium is, all of those details, which I will also put in the show notes?
Sure. The museum at FIT is on the corner of 7th Avenue and West 27th Street in Manhattan, right behind a big sculpture. The show opens on September 10th and goes through January 3rd. It's open Wednesday through Friday from noon to 8 p.m. and Saturday and Sunday from 10 to 5. The symposium is November 14th, and it's from roughly 10 to 5 o'clock. The museum is completely free to the public. The symposium is also free, but we encourage people to try and register for it. So you could go to the museum's website, which is www.fitnyc.edu/museum.
We have both already registered for the symposium and are excited for it. Thank you so much for joining us. This was such a joy.
That's magnificent.
Oh, thank you. This was really fun.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. Ordinary Unhappiness is made possible and kept ad-free for everyone by the generous support of our Patreon community. If you'd like to support the show and get 2 additional Patreon episodes per month, including our journey through the standard edition, please head on over to patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Valerie Steele. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.